and welcome to The Bottom Line here on TVP World, and this is where we unpack some of the main business and economic stories of the day. I'm your host, Marie Casey. Europe is number one for Chinese exports, and China is Europe's third most important market. Together, those two partners account for 30% of global trade. It seems like a good starting point for a cordial relationship, but lately it's anything but. Jan Kennedy brings us the details.
The European Commission's Asia tour has kicked off. The first stop on President von der Leyen's trip, the 30th EU-Japan summit in Tokyo, where she celebrated the successful economic partnership.
We build here on the strong foundation of our economic partnership agreement. It has risen in the last 6 years. The trade between our economies has increased by over 20%.
But Japan was easy. And now comes the hard part. On Thursday, von der Leyen and Antonio Costa will travel to Beijing for a meeting that marks the 50th anniversary of bilateral relations. But with divisions between the two economic giants growing, experts are not optimistic about a breakthrough.
I think the cooperation opportunities are now overshadowed by increasing tensions and industrial competition that is very much present in all of European debates. So I wouldn't expect any successful deals to be made.
Last month, the EU banned Chinese companies from taking part in tenders for medical equipment over a certain value, and earlier this year raised tariffs on the import of Chinese EVs up to as much as 50%. On top of that, EU officials have been especially vocal about cheap Chinese goods flooding the EU market, as well as the widening trade gap. In 2024, EU-China trade reached €732 billion, but the balance heavily favours China, which exports some €300 billion worth of goods more than the EU. And even though Europe is the primary export market for Chinese goods, trade has become a contentious part in their relations.
The silent part of the diplomatic tug of war is that we actually are in the middle of a trade war between China and Europe. The fact that it's often overlooked is that right after Trump imposed tariffs on China back in April this year, China has responded with limiting exports of so-called heavy rare earths, crucial materials, usually magnets used in electric vehicles and electric motors.
And to make matters worse, there is growing pressure from across the Atlantic, with President Donald Trump threatening to impose tariffs as high as 30% starting August 1st.
It's a huge pressure which makes it extremely difficult for the EU to be otherwise than, I should say, tactical. Try and seek with each partner where the pressure might be let off, where there could be concessions.
With this in mind, the EU has a tough task of avoiding entanglement in a trade war on two fronts.
So at the moment, no one is holding their breath for any massive successful outcomes. And in the meantime, we're going to take a look at where trade relations stand between China and the EU in recent years, the main points of contention, and where they could perhaps put on a united front, or at least choose to be more strategic about their economic cooperation. And to get more insight on all this, I'm pleased to welcome Ignacy Morawski, Chief Economist and Deputy Editor-in-Chief at the Polish business daily Puls Biznesu. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us.
Hello.
Hello,
good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon. We've seen the numbers in the feature. Total trade in goods between the EU and China amounts to €732 billion and around €100 billion more when services are actually accounted for. But Europe has been running a big deficit, €300 billion lately. Why isn't Europe using this deficit as a leverage in talks with China?
Well, it doesn't have a lot of leverage, actually, with respect to China, because at the same time, the European Union is struggling with the trade relations with the United States. This is the first challenge. And the second challenge, probably much more important, is that there is no unified trade and investment policy in the European Union. So obviously the EU has a right to set tariffs, but each country has its own economic policy and its own trade and investment policy with respect to building partnerships, trade relations, investment relations. And we can see diverging views and interests within the European Union. So there are countries which are pushing strongly towards closer partnership with China, closer cooperation, more openness. And Germany is a primary among those. And there are countries who are more sort of push more towards protectionist policies like France. So those diverging interests within the European Union make it much more difficult to negotiate. On the other side of the table, there is a unified government run by a strong leader. So there is a discrepancy, I would say, of negotiation power.
So do you think Germany is an example of one of those countries that has a slightly different approach?
Well, Germany as a country which is very much dependent on exports and exports growth wants to protect open trade, investments, and close partnership with China. Obviously, German politicians have started to talk about de-risking of German supply chains, so moving supply chains a bit away from China. But in general, they are advocating a close economic partnership between the European Union and China. The good example of that was the approach towards automotive tariffs last year, when the European Commission introduced automotive tariffs or tariffs on Chinese electric cars. Germany voted against, right? It wanted to veto the tariffs, whereas France and Poland supported the tariff policy of European Union. So Germany is open to, I would say, to Chinese capital and trade relations with China. The other country which has recently been pushing towards closer relations with China is Spain. Spanish Prime Minister went to Beijing, had a good visit in China. There are we can observe increasing Chinese investments in Spain in manufacturing. So Spain is trying to build closer partnership with China. So each country has its own policy, its own goals, and it's difficult to put that puzzle together.
But coming back to the summit, what are the most significant issues, in your opinion, that the EU and China need to resolve? Because obviously subsidies come to mind when it comes to EVs, and then obviously there is the market access problem, like when it comes to medical devices.
Well, the trade between those two economic blocks is quite large. As you said, in total, it is more than 700 billion euro a year. So there are many sectors and probably many sectoral issues that has to be resolved. I wouldn't like to dwell into each sectoral problem. In general, the problem is that the EU runs huge trade deficit with China. And in the past, it was not a problem because at the same time, the EU has run or had been running a huge trade surplus with other countries, especially United States. So at the time when the EU had a trade deficit with China, it registered surplus with other parts of the world. However, nowadays, Americans tell Europe that they don't want to see European surpluses anymore, right? They want to kill the European surplus. They want to balance the trade. So Europe will be left, if the US policy is successful. We don't know if it is, but let's assume for the moment that US policy is successful. So at the same time, when Americans are pushing for more balanced trade relations, EU is running huge trade deficit with China. the deficit is really large. It is 300 billion euro a year. So Europe would like to see the trade deficit diminished. And it can be resolved in two ways. Either the EU cuts imports from China, which is difficult because in many sectors, European companies are dependent on supply chains originating in China. Or the other solution would be to increase exports to China. But that requires, not only higher market access, better market access for European products, but it also requires different economic policy in China. It requires economic policy which would support domestic demand. Because China do not import as much as it exports, because China has suppressed domestic demand for many years. So the only way to balance the trade between EU and China is to push China to increase domestic demand.
So basically, there's no way that we can't really resolve this deficit
Chinese
issue.
say this is the matter of culture, and Chinese say this is the matter of culture and different approach to life in general. So this is the conflicting problem.
There's been this increasing concern about Chinese goods flooding European markets due to the US-China trade war, but we can't really pinpoint this sort of data. So is the deficit a consequence of this overcapacity that some politicians and economists have been warning for years now?
Well, the phenomenon that you are talking about now has been observed over the last couple of months only, right? So we're talking about increased imports from China in May and June. The goods that were not sold by China to the United States ended up in various parts of the world. Some of them went to Vietnam, some of them went to other Asian countries, and some of them went to Europe. So we can see that the exports from China to European Union in May and June increased because China has a very large production capacity, and it does not cut production at the time when the United States limit Chinese imports. This is interesting. So US tells China, we don't want your goods. At least not as much as previously. But China do not respond with cutting the production capacity, right? Because the production dynamics in China is still quite high. It's much higher than in US, it's much higher than in European Union, but it tries to push those products to other markets at cost of deepening industrial deflation and rising problems with insolvencies. So in China, 1 in 4 private companies is loss-making, right? This rate is really staggering. So Chinese industrial companies, private ones, are to a large extent loss-making companies because they have to cut prices to sell products to other parts of the world. So I suppose that Chinese economic policy is difficult to sustain in the long term. So that might be sort of a point where the EU can place its hopes that Chinese policy is difficult to sustain. It causes deflation, raising debt, insolvencies, and to me, it seems that China will also try to look to, change its economic course over the next couple of years.
There are some other problems that I wanted to pick your mind when it comes to export controls, like rare earths, where China leads the way in extraction and refining. There was an article in the FT where it quoted an international official last week who said that China could freeze Western energy, high-tech and defense sectors tomorrow by cutting the supply of certain minerals. So China really does have the upper hand, and I wanted to ask your thoughts on that.
This is classical interdependence. So the situation when both sides have, they're so much interconnected that it's really difficult to work without each other. On the one hand, China can cut exports of critical materials, and not only critical materials like rare earths, metals, but also other supply chain elements. Europe is dependent on China in many areas like pharmaceuticals or some machinery parts. So, China has leverage by controlling certain supply chains. On the other hand, obviously, Europe as a larger buyer has some leverage. This leverage is weakened by political considerations, but it has, right? So if China uses the atomic option and totally cuts exports of critical components and goods, the other side may respond by introducing high tariffs or cutting imports totally. So, it's not easy to introduce radical measures in the interconnected world. United States do that because they have, they are the most powerful country still globally. So they can behave in such a way. But still,
it's interesting.
They sort of face challenges with that. But Europe and China, with respect to each other, cannot do that probably.
Well, there's another interesting angle on this because Janka Ortel from the European Council of Foreign Relations wrote that China's rare earth restrictions have actually forced Washington to make concessions, and that Beijing is now emboldened and wants to use that same tactic on the EU. Perhaps this will come up in tomorrow's summit, and it's opened doors to Chinese investment. But she also says that Europe shouldn't budge. So what is your take on that? Does Europe actually have leverage on that front?
Well, this is a complex problem because my view is one, I would say, side, right? But the other side is political realism. My view is that the general approach of trade policy between large economic blocs should aim at balancing trade relations. So between Europe as a whole, as European Economic Area, so European Union and some other developed countries in Europe, between European Economic Area, China, and the United States, we should not see large trade imbalances, neither deficits nor surpluses. So if we register trade imbalance with China, Europe should push China to increase demand for domestic products. It should be a policy like 1 for 1. We buy your goods, you buy our goods. But in practice and in political reality, this is very difficult to achieve. And probably it is impossible to balance trade between Europe and China. So Europe, to some extent, has to accept the imbalance and deficit with relations to China, but what Europe has to do is to protect vital industries and technologies from not only competition from China, but also purging by Chinese competition, right? In many supply chains, China is so dominant that European companies struggle to survive. So Europe should look at protecting vital industries and technologies from Chinese competition. That's one thing. It should look at pressuring China to increase domestic demand, accepting more products from China. That's the other thing. But in the end, the most important thing is that, in my view, the EU should not treat China as an alternative to the United States. That would be risky. I read some opinions that some politicians in the EU would like to see China as an alternative to the United States, as a way to de-risk from unpredictability of Donald Trump.
Okay,
But that would be a very risky
we're going to have to park our conversation now. Ignacy Morawski, Chief Economist and Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Polish business daily Puls Biznesu. So thanks so much for joining us again today.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Great.
And that concludes The Bottom Line for today. I was your host, Marie Cato. We bring you the best of regional business Monday to Friday at 5:10 CET on TVP World. And in the meantime, for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. Goodbye.